your host, Riley Bounds, and this is the Solum Podcast, where we discuss and examine the intersection of the modern renaissances in evangelical literature, philosophy, and spiritual formation. Today, I'm excited to have author Elizabeth Genovise on the podcast. Elizabeth Genovise is an O. Henry Prize recipient and a recent inductee into the Tennessee Literary Hall of Fame. She is the author of 3 collections of short stories, the most recent being Posing Nude for the Saints by the Texas Review Press. The 4th book, Palindrome, is due out from Texas Review Press in 2022. More information will be given in the show notes, including links to her author website, recent publications, and her contributor profile on the Solum website if you want to find out more. So Elizabeth, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Well, why don't you just tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, well, I grew up in the Chicago area, and I went to college in Michigan, and then I ended up doing an MFA in fiction down at McNeese State University in Louisiana. And then after that, I moved to Tennessee, and that's where I've been ever since. I'm a teacher out here. I'm married. I live in the Knoxville area. Oak Ridge is where I actually live, and I teach creative writing as much as I can when I'm not teaching my other classes.
What other classes do you teach?
English composition, American literature, things like that.
Oh wow, that's a pretty wide range.
Yeah,
that's cool. So when did you really start writing in earnest?
I wrote a lot of poetry when I was in college, and when I graduated college, my intention was to go get a PhD in English. I was thinking I was going to be an academic, and I didn't know myself very well because that's not me. It never was me. But I started a PhD program, and during the first year, I was so unbelievably just bored and disillusioned, and I just found myself writing fiction. That's just what I was doing. I wasn't really thinking about it intellectually. Why am I doing this? I was just doing it. And this was at the University of Iowa, which has pretty much the country's best MFA program. And I was actually living with someone who was in that program. So through her, I started meeting people who were in the MFA. I started auditing classes with Marilyn Robinson. And I realized that's what I wanted. I was in the wrong degree, wrong field, wrong career path, everything. And so I started, writing more seriously. And then before that first year was over, I had taken, the best of my fiction and applied to an MFA program down in Louisiana, and I was accepted. So I left the following year for that. So I basically just kind of changed courses throughout that first year.
Gotcha. Would you say that was the kind of moment in your development when you realized that you were a writer?
Yeah, because I realized that, for one, like I said, I wasn't an academic. I didn't want to me, like academia, it's the study of signs, not symbols. It's the study of dead things. And I really wanted to participate in something that was still breathing. And that's what art is to me. Art is still alive. And when I was working on my fiction, I mean, of course, it was terrible because that was my first year writing. It was absolutely awful, but I was trying. And I just felt like I was in touch with something. And I wanted to stay close to that pulse. And then I realized the MFA was a way to do that, but in an organized, committed way. I didn't want to be a hippie type artist, just kind of throwing paint at the wall. I wanted to do the boot camp and learn the craft and study. And then when I did the MFA, everything felt exactly right. I knew that's exactly where I was supposed to be.
Gotcha. Now, you have written poetry in addition to fiction. Would you consider yourself a kind of a poet that writes a lot of fiction, or
No.
like a fiction writer? Oh, okay.
No, no, I'm definitely a fiction writer. I don't know. I write poetry just once in a blue moon. There's a moment, and it's like, okay, this isn't supposed to be a story. This is supposed to be a poem. I rarely submit stuff. I submit poems maybe once every 2 or 3 years to a journal. Yeah, I'm not a poet. Definitely not.
Well, you are published in poetry, so I mean,
just a little bit, but I'm not a poet. No.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I noticed in your literary style, You do have quite a few poetic lines in your fiction. Meridian, the one we published in Solum Journal, is just chock full of them. So it seems like that's still in you somewhere, you know.
Oh no, it is. I mean, I can actually recall turning in a story once to workshop in the MFA, and the MFA director saying, "Do you realize that like this entire first page is in iambic pentameter?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" You know, like I had no idea, but it was kind of bred into me because I loved poetry growing up, and I did write it a lot, but I didn't know what I was doing. So
Mhm.
yeah, I mean that I know that lyricism definitely manifests itself in my work, but fiction is my true love,
Mm.
not poetry.
What about fiction influences?
I've always been very influenced by the canonical Russians, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Those are kind of the top two for me. East of Eden by Steinbeck is one of my favorite books of all time.
Mm.
I love Cormac McCarthy, The Road in particular, that one.
Mm.
Wallace Stegner's novels are absolutely amazing. I love Marilyn Robinson's work. I love Chekhov's stories, and I think probably my favorite, more contemporary short story writer would be Andre Dubus. I teach him in my classes. I try to keep him as close to me as I can. He's
Gotcha.
marvelous.
Mm. Yeah, I noticed that, like namely McCarthy, some of those writers they deal pretty heavily with place in
Hmm.
their narrative. It seems like place is really their main narrative inspiration as opposed to like plot. So would you say that places are a big part of your artistic inspiration too?
Sometimes, I mean, my work is more character focused, but um, I just personally have very strong responses to setting.
Mhm.
Setting is never neutral for me. And yeah, I mean, I get to know a place and it moves me and it needles me, and I start thinking about what it means, kind of like this, what might be symbolic in the landscape, and then it just
Mhm.
ends up sort of feeding into a story. But the landscape doesn't birth a story. It's like the story's already there, and then I realize this is the perfect landscape for it, and then the two sort of start to work together.
You've primarily developed in the South, right? As a writer, I mean,
Yeah, I would say I became a writer in the South. Absolutely. Yeah.
right? Um, yeah, I've noticed that your fiction has quite a bit of grit. I mean, not even like in tone, but just like in material. Meridian is quite heavy, and so is your other work. So I just kind of wondered, like, if that Southern influence kind of gave you a bit of grit, or is that kind of just already there?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't read. I don't read a lot of, I guess, what you would call Southern fiction. I'm not sure, how that came about. I don't know if that has anything to do with the region, or it's just. I couldn't explain to anyone how I come up with the ideas for any of those stories. I mean, it's such a mysterious, kind of nameless process. You just wake up one day and this thing has bubbled to the surface overnight, and then it's time to start pursuing it. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think probably my stories have gotten a little grittier as I've gotten older, just because the older you get, kind of the more pain you witness, and you go through more, and you get a little more taste of hell every
Mhm.
year. It sounds really morbid. I see it as a positive thing though, but um, yeah, I think that my earlier fiction was a little bit fluffier because I just hadn't really seen much darkness. In my
Yeah.
mid 20s, life was just kind of good and it was all cupcakes and balloons. So I didn't really have so much grit in the stories.
Cupcakes and balloons.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, that darkness that you experienced certainly gave you a lot of recognition. Um, you received the O. Henry Prize, and you were recently inducted into the Tennessee Literary Hall of Fame. That's incredible. So, what was that like for you?
Honestly, when I got that email saying that I was receiving the O. Henry Prize, I thought it was a practical joke, and I was very close to responding. I don't know who this is, but I didn't fall for it. Seriously, I'm not making this up, because I have friends who could do that. I could see them doing that. I mean, I have a lot of prankster friends. And then I read it more carefully, and I was like, no, wait a minute. I think that's real. And I was really shocked, and not just because I don't really see myself as being good enough to be in an anthology like that, but also because of the particular story that they chose. After that anthology was published, actually, it was pretty unpleasant. Like, I had a couple people approach me who didn't even really know me, and they were very angry, and they accused me of writing like a quote unquote pro-life story. And which that was never my intention. That was not in my head when I wrote it. I don't write like that. I don't write with an agenda. But I was kind of amazed that they were willing to publish it in a book that would get that much attention, because there probably, I'm sure obviously there were undoubtedly people who responded to that and said, how can you publish a story where someone's planning to have an abortion and then they change their mind? That's politically incorrect. Like, you can't talk about this kind of thing. So that was kind of surprising and that particular story was rejected like 26 times, I think.
Wow.
When sometimes within like a 24-hour period. I mean, it was just boom, they'd send it right back. And then the Cimarron Review accepted it, and that's how it ended up getting nominated for the O. Henry. So it was just one editor who was willing to take a chance on it. And that changed a lot for me, because when you send stories to journals and you have to give them your quick bio, you can say, I have a story in the O. Henry anthology. And then even if they don't like anything else about your resume, they might read it anyway. And next thing you know, you're getting more stories published, and that leads to more books. And so it's all been a good thing. I'm very grateful.
Yeah, I really admire your persistence. I mean, a lot of people would have just thought, well, there must be something wrong with the story if people don't believe in it. But that's not the case. So yeah, I like that you stuck it out. And it's very sad. The writing culture now is just so willing to read like a political implication into something like that.
Yeah.
When it's probably the case that I imagine that you arrived at that ending because it seemed warranted from the characterization, right?
Right. I mean, that's how it always goes. That's the way it happens. They take over. I mean, people who aren't writers don't understand that. They think that anything an artist creates is you're in full control, right? And that's not how it works. And when you try to explain to someone, well, no, characters they start breathing, they start doing things. They look at you like you're insane, because they don't, they can't grasp that. And I don't blame them, right? I mean, it's not their fault. If their brain doesn't work like that, then that's a big leap that you're asking that person to make. But no, I've never done that. Honestly, if I catch myself, if I'm writing something and I realize I'm only writing this because I have this thing, like an axe I want to grind or something I want to say, then that's it. I mean, I just terminate that project because I know it's not going to be organic. It's just me kind of kvetching. And what's the point of that? I mean, that might make me feel better when it's all said and done, but that's not art. So I'm going to walk away from something like that.
Yeah. It could be therapeutic, but it only kind of works as a piece if the therapy can apply to the other person too.
That's right. That's right. That's why you can't submit a journal entry or a diary entry to a publisher. It's just a really bad idea.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, why do you write in the first place, you think?
I mean, what a question. Honestly, that question for me is really darn close to asking, why do you believe, or why do you have a spiritual life? I feel like the answers are very similar. I write because I want to search for truth. I want to engage with it. I want to grow as a person. It's not just a matter of loving the craft or loving the act of writing, because a lot of times I hate the act of writing. It's very painful. It's agonizing. It's not fun. But and I want to live my life as close to the numinous as I can. And writing to me is the most high stakes way that I can do that. I think you can tap into the numinous by reading something or watching a movie or listening to a very powerful piece of music. But when you're actually trying to engage with it, then you're really taking chances. You're entering some pretty scary territory. And I guess I have a little bit of a, I don't know, what's that called? Like an adrenaline junkie, but on a spiritual level. I want to be in that space as uncomfortable and as high tension as it can be. I want to be in that space. And if things happen in my life where for some reason I can't for a long period of time, I just start withering. It's like I need that. I need that to feel like I'm growing and evolving and that I'm whole. So that's why I do it. I think if I couldn't do it, I'd be really lost, honestly.
Mm. So in that way, you think that fiction can kind of help us get at truth, then, right?
Yes, I think that's the whole function of art. Yeah, I think that's why people are afraid of it. That's why art is so
Yeah.
scary. I mean, isn't
Yeah.
that the whole point of a museum is to like you put frames around things and you tuck them into these neatly organized rooms and then you can pretend that you have mastery over them.
Mm.
We can pretend like you can put these things in a filing cabinet and then they have less power. So I think, it's an instinct. That's why you even put a frame around a painting. It's just an instinct to say, I can draw boundaries around this. Because you're afraid of what it's going to do to you if you don't.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's why we should care about fiction. It can help us to get at truth. And I think that part of the problem today, and why people aren't connecting with more artists, is that people don't believe in truth in the artistic sphere anymore. They think that everything is subjective. There's no truth, there's no objective beauty
Mm-hmm.
to a piece. There's no objective standard of what's good, and so on and so forth. And which is, I think, circular, because they're assuming the truth of that statement.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, of
So
course.
I really admire that you're willing to just be like, I'm telling you what I think is true, or like, I'm trying to find out the truth through my fiction. I'm trying to
Yeah,
share
that's
that.
closer to what it is. Yeah. I'm
Right.
discovering it as I'm writing, I don't
Right.
go in with, oh, I've learned this thing. Now I'm going to invent some characters to help me show the world this
Yeah.
thing that I know.
Right. I mean, yeah, it seems that fiction is just not the place for preaching, or art in general. I think too. It's just not the place to proselytize.
Right.
I mean, it can be a witness to something if you let it develop organically. Um, well, why don't you tell us a bit about Meridian, your short story in Solum Journal, Volume 2?
Um, well, the trigger for that story was the weirdest thing. My husband was watching like a physics documentary, and it was highly involved and kind of over my head because I'm sort of a verbal person. I'm one of those people, I barely made it through my math and science classes all through high school and college. But he likes these things. So he had this on, and I was actually reading while he was watching it, and I just kept putting the book down and looking up, and I was like, wait a second, there's something going on here. And then after he finished it, I found it on Amazon, and then I watched it at work in my office hours like 3 times, and I realized I don't know how this is going to end up being a story, but it is going to be, because there was something, very kind of upsetting about these concepts that they were being discussed in this physics documentary. And I just let it be, because I don't overthink. I just kind of let it sit in the back of my head. And I had been kind of had this character in my mind for a while, this woman who is kind of obsessed with revenge. And next thing I knew, the two were sort of crossing together. I mean, that's how it goes. It's like different things just sort of ferment in my head for a while, and then I wake up and I realize they belong together. And so I just started writing this.
Hmm. Well, why don't you tell us what the title means?
Actually, I was thinking about when I came up with the title, I was thinking about Solzhenitsyn's line about how the line between good and evil cuts straight through the heart of every man.
Hmm.
And that's, I realized when I finished the story, that was the essence of the story, right? I mean, she even draws a physical line down her palm with the knife in that final scene. It's symbolic, it's meant to represent this idea that we all have the shadow within, and she makes that discovery at the end of the story, and it starts to transform her as a person. And then that was just the word. I thought Meridian was a good word to kind of encapsulate that idea.
Would you consider the story psychological fiction?
Yeah, I actually probably would consider most of my work, if you had to put into some kind of category,
Hmm.
psychological. Yeah. I mean, that's what interests me, the human psyche, the human spirit.
Right. I mean, but to that end, do you kind of hesitate to put genre labels on your fiction just
Yes.
at all? Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I've had people ask me like, oh, do you write regional fiction, Southern fiction, whatever. I hate that, honestly, because
Mm,
like as soon as you apply a label to it, people are expecting certain elements to be there. They're expecting certain formulas. And I mean, I just don't write that way. Honestly, that's part of the reason it's hard. It's probably harder for me than it is for some writers to publish short story collections because publishers really like it when they're linked or there's some kind of common theme.
mhm,
And I don't do that. I mean, I never could. I can't imagine writing a story and being like, well, how can I make this fit into this box? So I'm not going to
mhm,
write this until I know that it fits. Like for me, each story is a completely different universe. It's its own thing. It's the only thing until it's done. And then some
mhm,
other thing is going to happen in 2 more months, and that's its own thing. Um, and the last couple books I wrote, most of the stories were set here in Tennessee because this is where I've lived now for 10 years, and I know the area, and um, it was just natural. But I didn't set out to write regional fiction. So yeah, I mean, I if people ask me what I write, I just say literary fiction. That's it.
yeah, yeah. Well, that does make sense. And yeah, I hear the kind of the same thing with musicians. And I guess it is kind of an advertising thing. Like if you ascribe it to some certain genre, then it's easier to find
Right,
or easier to
right.
sell or whatever. I mean, but I guess truth isn't really a concern with genre, you know.
No, it's
So
not.
yeah, so yeah, no, I like that. Um, so in Meridian, there's two narrative streams that go on simultaneously. Not simultaneously, but one of these streams is Eva's dealing with the death of her family, which spurs her on to exact revenge. And then there's also a school shooting that occurs before the story starts. How do you think that those two streams of narrative complement each other?
Well, I needed both because they're contrasting with each other because like the first one is earlier in time, and the first time around when her husband and daughter are killed, she's in this vengeful mode, right? She's just full of rage and resentment,
Hmm.
and it ends badly in that she doesn't actually kill this woman who murdered her family, but the only reason she decides not to kill her is because she knows she's going to get caught. So there's no
Hmm.
sort of spiritual evolution. And then the second time around, when she wants revenge after the school shooting, this time she gets it right. This time there's actually an evolution where by the end of the story she's in a different place. She's no longer just resentful and projecting all her rage and disappointment and grief onto the outside world. So I wanted to show, the first time around there was no change, and the second time all the right factors kind of come into play in her life, and she actually has a chance to evolve and move
Hmm.
up.
Hmm. So in that way, you would say that Eva does experience some movement, and some progress.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't want the ending to be. I really struggled writing the ending, the last like paragraph, because I didn't want it to be cheesy, where it's just, oh, she has this dream that kind of fixes everything for her, and now she's just everything's perfect. But I was hoping that, the implication is she's starting to change in a very significant way. She goes out
Hmm.
and she buys Ira lunch, and it's the first thing she's probably done for another human being in 3 years. She's getting outside of herself. And then when she flips the channel on the TV and human faces appear, um, it's the same idea. It's that, she spent the last few years, she doesn't even see people, right? She just sees everyone she sees is just a symbol of an idea,
Hmm.
and so it's easier for her to hate them, to project her hatred onto them because they're not individuals. But by the end of the story, through Ira and then, these experiences, these dreams and visions, that's starting to shift. It's a seismic shift in her personality and her spirituality, where instead of seeing people as they're just representatives of all the things that she hates, they're people, they're individual people. So maybe
Hmm.
from this point on, there's upward movement.
Hmm. It did seem like there was some kind of spiritual growth for Eva. Not like necessarily like a Christian conversion or anything like that, but like almost kind of a resurrection of her soul in a way. Would you
Yeah.
say that that's kind of fair?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that, and for her, the way that happens is her recognition of her own shadow.
Mm,
When she, in that final kind of vision, when she realizes that the reason this kid didn't fire on her was he looked at her and he knew that her soul was already gone. What was the point?
mm,
You know,
mhm.
she's a nihilist. There was nothing to be killed. And I think when she realizes that that's the person she's become, and that she has all this darkness within her, and it's not something she can just pin on the people around her, that's when the big shift takes place.
Mm. Yeah, I know that you don't like set out to, like to be a proponent of one any particular like view when you write, but it does seem like leading away from nihilism. I don't want to say that was intentional, but I mean, do you think that in the end there was some kind of purpose to that?
Yeah, I mean, I like I said, I don't write with an agenda, but everyone's beliefs and their passions obviously are going to weave themselves into their work in some way, and this happens a lot in my stories where characters end up sort of confronting themselves in a way they
Hmm.
haven't before. And, to me, that is, I mean, that's the Christian message, right? It's not the only religion that works this way, but that you can't really move forward until you start working on this, until you start
Hmm.
self-confronting. Um, and I try to, my characters are often, I catch them in these sort of critical moments where whatever decision they end up making is going to decide how their spiritual future is going to look, right? Are they going to be at war with the best version of themselves, or are they going to be in harmony with the best version of themselves? And I think she's moving towards the latter, at the end of this story.
Right. It kind of reminds me of, and I can't remember who told me this, but it was a Flannery O'Connor quote on how she wanted to write characters who, at the end of the story, act both in character and then go beyond character.
Mm,
Um, so,
yeah.
so yeah, I kind of see that with you too. And just offhand, are you influenced at all by Flannery's work?
Yes, I one of my favorite professors was a Flannery O'Connor scholar, and I love her work, and I usually teach one or two of her stories every semester. Mhm.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Reading through Flannery's short stories just recently, I kind of like paired that against Meridian. I was like, hey, there's a lot of stylistic similarities here, which is
Oh, that's
cool.
quite a compliment. I appreciate that.
Yeah. No problem.
She's a heck of a writer. She's incredible.
Oh yeah, definitely. And from Iowa too. The Iowa
Hmm.
workshop. Yeah. Um, well, was there any particular reason that you wanted to make Eva an academic in the story?
Academics, they really interest me because they think too much. And it's like buried somewhere in Carl Jung's writing. He has this line where he says that the intellect is a great cheat and illusionist when it tries to manipulate values.
Mm,
And that's what a lot of academics do is they try to invent values severed from the spiritual realm. And that's what Ava does. I mean, she's highly intelligent, she's an academic, and this is how her mind works, is she sort of invented this kind of logical system, and
mm,
she's pretty blunt about it. And there's a couple passages I think throughout the story where she basically says that, the gods from all these different religions are just sort of flaccid, because they don't know how to exercise justice. And she
mm,
thinks she has a corner on that idea, right? She's figured it out. This is what justice should look like, and I have every right to carry it out. And again, this wasn't planned. When I looked back at the story and read it, and I realized, it made perfect sense that what ends up sort of tipping her, it's it's all these kind of dreams slash visions. I guess they're more dreams that she's having throughout the course of the story that are kind of triggered by things that Ira says to her, or the pictures he's showing her in that physics book.
mm.
And, dreams, that's our bridge to the unconscious, right? And some people would argue that's the bridge to the spiritual or even to God. And that's how she gets there, is not by thinking through it intellectually, but through this kind of much more mysterious, inexplicable way where she has
Mm.
these visions. And it's almost like that other part of her mind is helping her work through things and helping her get to the truth, whereas she wasn't able to do this on a purely intellectual or logical plane.
Right. Yeah. Ira's name keeps coming up a lot. He seems to be, in a way, like the glue that holds the story together.
Hmm.
So he's quite an important character, isn't he?
Yeah, I actually see the two of them as a kind of yin yang, where,
Mm,
and I didn't even realize it again until after I wrote it that their names are almost identical. Um, he's her counterpoint. He's a person who believes. He's humble. He's
mhm,
clearly suffered. We don't know how, and it doesn't matter how, but he has suffered. But instead of blaming the world, his response to that is to take some burden on himself, right? Like he says, I came to this school because if anything else happens, I want to be ready to protect these kids. Like
mm,
he wants to take on responsibility. And he's the one who's kind of feeding her these images and ideas through these lectures that she overhears and the pictures he shows her. And those things end up, like I said, kind of seeding into her dreams. So yeah, they're working together almost like a yin yang. Like she needs someone who's her total opposite to work on her in that way to kind of start moving her character development forward.
mhm. Right. Um, well, the woman who killed Eva's family in a car wreck, she suffers from grief as well. We come to find out. Do you think that the story is an examination of grief and how it affects different people?
I hadn't thought of it that way. But yeah, I mean, I think there is something to that, and I think when I'm trying to think how to phrase this. I think that, because of culture and Hollywood and things like that, that a lot of people have this idea that evil stems from, someone's there's something wrong in them that's just it's intrinsically it's already there. When you have someone who
Mhm,
grows up to be a murderer, right? The question is, what's wrong with that person?
mhm,
And I don't think it occurs to too many people that for a lot of people, quote unquote, evil, if that's the word you want to use, it starts with grief. It starts with,
mhm,
someone's plunged into sorrow and they don't have faith to kind of get them through that. And so their response to grief is rage and resentment and a murderous heart. Um, and that's Ava all the way. I mean, that's who she is. Like, she makes it very clear that she's never had a kind of a spiritual life. She's never believed in any kind of higher purpose. And so when life throws this horrible tragedy at her and she's thrown into grief, her response is rage.
mhm,
It's a violent response. And I think this happens to a lot of people. Like they go through a terrible loss, they lose a child, God knows what it is. And um, instead of being softened by that experience, which other people are, they're hardened by it. And then they start trying to seek justice in their own kind of way, right? For that thing that
mhm.
they lost. They want to be compensated for their loss. And so they start hurting other people or suing people or whatever it is that is at hand, right? That they can do to compensate for what's been taken from them.
Right. Evil is not just in the realm of psychopaths. I mean, we're all capable of it,
Yeah.
depending on what we've been through and how we respond. So yeah, I quite like that a lot. Uh, Now, some of your work is influenced by Christian theology. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I really believe that the Christ path, the path of the oldest heroes and all the really old myths like Gilgamesh and Beowulf and the heroes in Tolkien's novels, I think that's the artist's path. I think that to create art, you have to go into the darkness, you have to suffer, you have to go into unknown territory, you have to self-confront. That's the straight and narrow gate, and I think that's the only route to creating something that's worth a damn. And like when I teach creative writing, and sometimes in actually my upper level literature classes, I'll start by telling students that the most important story in the world can be told in 5 words: the truth teller must die. And
Mm,
on first glance, we can say, okay, well, if you look at history and in fiction, that's literally true, right? Historically, Socrates, Christ, all these different saints, sometimes even scientists, anyone who speaks an uncomfortable truth, society is going to try to burn that person down, right? But on a
mm,
on a deeper level, it applies to the artist because if you want to speak the truth, some part of you has to die first. You have to admit there are things you don't know, because art is discovered, not made. You don't make it, you discover it. And I think, Christianity tells that story in which your suffering has meaning. You don't climb up the hill with the burden on your back because it's rational, or because the group tells you to do it, or because you want to be seen doing it. You do it because that's the only way that you can figure out who you're meant to be, that you can find fulfillment. And you're making all these discoveries as you do this, right? You're learning things you didn't know. And that's the process of making art, is that you're going into a place you've never been, and it's going to be terrifying, and you're going to have to self-confront in a way that's not comfortable. But once you do that, you can maybe bring something to the world, right? As opposed to what I see as sort of the opposite tactic, like you'd get from like an ideologically possessed person, where they sit down to write, and they end up basically just promoting an agenda. They write and they think like a totalitarian, like everything I know is everything I need to know. I'm going to take this thing I know, and now I'm going to turn it into a novel, or a poem, or whatever it is. So there's no active discovery, and I think that kind of work ends up being pretty sterile, and it doesn't last, doesn't have an impact on the human heart anyway. So my view of what it is to be a good Christian, to be to fulfill your spiritual path, let's say, feeds pretty directly into my artistic process. Because if I catch myself kind of coming at it the wrong way, where it is, like I said earlier, I have an idea, and now I'm just trying to push it on someone, then I know that I have to walk away from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are certainly some commonalities between different religious systems and the component of suffering and all that, and feeding that into their narrative. But is there any particular reason that you find the Christian narrative different or particularly inspiring?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question to answer, but I think the first thing about the Christian narrative, I think the most important thing is the emphasis on individual responsibility. Participating in your own redemption, that's like the supremely creative act. There's nothing more creative that you can do, right? And I think, Christian or not, everyone knows deep down this is what it takes to reach fulfillment as a human being, because the toughest way is always going to be the most meaningful way. And Christianity, emphasizes that. You take the darkest route through the forest. That's how you get there. And the other thing is the stress that's placed on individual transcendent experience. And I think it was maybe like 2 years ago that a really good friend of mine, he sent me this quote that he had found, something Dostoevsky had said. And I was shocked. I'd never seen it before, because I've been studying Dostoevsky for like 15 years. And I think it was from a biography, but it was something he said when he was released from Siberian prison. And I hope I don't butcher this, but he said, if someone proved to me that Christ was outside the truth and the truth was outside Christ, then I would rather remain with Christ than with the truth. And I just thought, God, he nailed it. I mean, that's it. That's Christianity. And, that's actually probably the Brothers Karamazov summed up into one sentence. Because, when I heard this, I thought right away about that chapter early in Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan and Alyosha Karamazov have this conversation, and Ivan presents this very brilliant logical argument that's meant to sort of decimate Alyosha's faith in God, in Christ, or in the kind of larger purpose for the universe. And it is a brilliant argument. It's really difficult to rebut it. And the readers know that there's no way Alyosha has the intellect to battle what he's just heard, even though he's a believer. He's very deeply spiritual. And you're kind of waiting to see what happens. What Alyosha does is he stands up to leave, but he just kisses his brother before he goes. And it just completely, knocks Ivan down, because Ivan is intelligent enough to understand the symbolic value of what's just happened. And the thing is, Alyosha, he can love irrationally because he's open to possibilities outside of what he can recognize on a purely intellectual level. And Ivan cannot love like that. He's not capable of really love at all, you might argue, because he's not open to that. And the reason Alyosha has access to this is because he has all these individual transcendent experiences as a very spiritual person. And these experiences link him to that higher purpose, right? That sort of that hidden world that, we all have this yearning for. And Christianity shows us how to live like that. It shows us how you exist in profane time, but you partake in sacred time, and you use what you learn from the latter to enrich the former. And I love that. What more can you ask for?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
The value of those experiences.
So what do you think that Christian writers can do to improve their craft?
Well, when I hear that phrase Christian writers, or when I think of Christian fiction, like the image that pops into my head is like the inside of a Christian bookstore, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I guess the kind of stuff that's being published under that genre that they're calling Christian fiction, it just tends to be pretty insipid, pretty formulaic, and kind of empty. I don't think I've ever read anything that you'd pull off a shelf in that section of a bookstore and, where I was actually moved by it and thought, this is, there's revelation here. That doesn't happen. Like, I think that if I met someone who said, I'm a Christian and I want to write literary fiction, I want to make art, then I would say, well, make sure that's really the road you're on. Like, don't start writing genre fiction, Christian pop fiction, let's say. Don't write for like a Wednesday night church youth group. Like, write like a literary writer, where you are open to questioning, and your audience, your readers, are going to be open to questioning. Write for people who would rather learn something than just be affirmed in what they already know. And I think that's a lot of what Christian fiction does, is it just makes people feel comfortable with what they already know and believe. And there's no real purpose to that. Even the Bible doesn't do that. Because art is supposed to needle people, not comfort them. And there's absolutely no excuse for Christian literature to be any different. I think it's actually just the opposite. I think there's an even bigger responsibility. If you're a Christian, then you better be writing things that are asking tough questions, that, something that takes on a high level of accountability, because you need to practice what you preach.
Right. Yeah. And if we just kind of pump out literature that's supposed to be comforting or whatever, then all you have is like comfort food.
Right.
There's no substance to the work. Well, why don't you tell us what the future kind of looks like for you now?
Well, my fourth book of short stories, Palindrome, is supposed to come out, I think, fall 2022 was the most recent update I had. And those stories are all, I didn't know it at the time, but I was working my way towards writing my first legit novel. And I think because I was getting into that mode, the stories are incredibly long. And I should have known what was happening, because just about as soon as I finished that book, then I ended up transitioning and working on this novel. I've actually written 2 or 3 novel manuscripts in the past, but they were just garbage. So they're gone. They were in a bonfire somewhere. They were like kind of training wheels, I guess. And but this one, I spent pretty much the entire, what I think of as the COVID year, this entire past year, because the college where I worked went completely online. I was home all the time. And it's not actually that I had more time on my hands, but I had more mental space than I usually have access to because I was physically separated from work. And this novel had probably been in the making for about 10 years. And I've been sort of running and hiding from it for a really long time. I was very afraid to sit down and try to do this. And then in this past year, it just happened. Everything just kind of fell into place, and it was time. So I pretty much spent the whole year working on that. And I've sent it to the same, my editor at Texas Review Press, but other than that, I've kept it pretty close to the chest because it's fairly new, but that's what I'm hoping to publish after the short story collection.
And And this is the one set in Wisconsin, right?
Yes, it's called Third Class Relics, and it's set way, way up there in northern Wisconsin on Lake Michigan.
Nice. Yeah, well, definitely looking forward to that. So, well, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. I really appreciate your time and just you being willing to come on. So thank you.
No, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it too.
All right, great. All right, thank you for listening.